Okay, Chapter 7, Commerce and Culture, 500 to 1500. And we will start with Section 1, Silk Roads, Exchange Across Eurasia. Chapter 7 is fascinating because it focuses on the trade and the cultural networks that developed in the third major period of what we cover in AP World History. And this particular textbook describes a variety of these systems together. And it works well with the themes and the key concepts that we cover in this course. It's not a bad idea to outline the major trade systems that we'll look at in this chapter: the Eurasian Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean sea trade, the Trans-Saharan sand roads, and even the network of commerce in the Americas. Okay, where is this statue from and what does it show? That's something to think about as you look at this picture. This ceramic figure is from the Tang Dynasty in China, early 600s to early 900s. Features a camel, and we can see a group of men sitting on top. Looks like one might be standing and seems to be looking into the distance right up over the camel's head. See a bearded man right here with what appears to be maybe a mandolin, which is a type of instrument. He's sitting up front. His hairstyle, it might be hard for you guys to see, but see, it's this tilted bun, and it's the same as the man standing behind him in this dark green coat, if you guys can see that. There are 3 other figures on the other side of the camel, so you can see they surround the man that's standing. Okay, and their facial structure suggests that maybe they're Chinese. You know that it's from Tang, China, but they do have that facial structure. There's one here, right there, that looks like he might be positioned as if he were playing an instrument, but he doesn't have the instrument. So this could be, and of course with the mandolin there, this could be a group of musicians traveling on a camel. And what does this figure tell us about the cultural significance of the Silk Road? The Silk Road was crucial in this rapidly expanding commercial network that linked China with Eurasia, all across that Central Asian region. And the people and the cultures adjacent to the Silk Road exchanged not only goods, but cultural artifacts and music. And this statue, there could, on the other side, there could be figures from Central Asia on there. It could show different ethnicities joined by music as they travel on the same camel. And that's a powerful expression of what used to be a harmonious cultural exchange. Okay, commerce and culture. Let's start with roots of economic globalization lie deep in the past. Nowadays, an Apple device ordered in the United States can be shipped in China and arrive in probably less than 2 days. But this speed of transaction is a very recent development. But it evokes older patterns of global commerce. And these roots of economic globalization are from way back in the past. The exchange of goods between different peoples in different ecological zones. That's a major feature of human history, and it's really a major accomplishment. Now, at times, some societies have monopolized desirable products, specifically the Silk Road, which is what we'll look at in this section. But long-distance trade became more important than ever in the years 500 to 1500. And oddly enough, that's after the fall of the Roman Empire. And during the Roman Empire and Han China, those two empires, that was really, at that particular time, that was really, all there was. Almost everything was encompassed in one of those two empires. And, both collapsed. So long-distance trade was more important than ever after that. And it was a good solid 1,000 years of very important exchange. And most trade was indirect. There were creations of networks of communication as well as exchange and trade across the Afro-Eurasian world. And notice that's Afro-Eurasian. That's Africa, Europe, and Asia. So we see a connection between 3 of the 7 continents. And there were separate webs in parts of the Americas. But you have to ask yourself, why was trade significant? Why is this economic activity and significant, and why do we learn about it? Well, it altered consumption, what people are taking in, encouraged specialization as opposed to producing everything that you need. You can produce just a few things and trade for what you don't have. And it can, realistically, you can look at something as simple as, you have chickens, and so you can trade eggs for milk from cows. But if you need fabric for clothing, what does that weaver who has the clothing and the fabric, what do they need? Do they need cows and, or, what you have? And, even though the products could be pretty simple, the trade networks could be pretty complex. And this really diminished economic self-sufficiency, especially in local societies. So it really opened up means of social mobility, becoming a merchant and gaining wealth, even provided some very prestigious items and goods for the elites. And sometimes the wealth from trade even motivated state creation. Religious ideas, technological innovations, plants, animals, disease, also spread along these trade routes. So it's not just this exchange of goods and communication, but we see the exchange of religious ideas, in this part of the world especially, Islam and Buddhism. Obviously, technological innovation. Someone else is doing something better than you. You create something that might even be better than what they have, but it works for your society. Obviously, plants and animals and the goods that are produced from those, and, of course, disease. And the network of long-distance trade is a very important feature of the third wave civilizations. Some people call it the High Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages, or the post-classical era, because we've got, classical Rome and classical Greece. But this particular text refers to it as the third wave civilizations. And so I'll use that term a lot because that's what you'll see in your readings. Okay, the Silk Roads. Exchange across Eurasia. The Silk Roads form one of the world's most extensive and sustained networks of exchange. It was largely relay trade. Hopefully you understand what that means. Is items passed between several stops and were traded between several groups before reaching their final destination. And it really provided a unity and a coherence to Eurasian history. Now, the growth of the silk trades, Eurasia is often divided into inner and outer zones with different ecologies. Outer Eurasia, it's relatively warm, plenty of water, and this is China, India, the Middle East, even the Mediterranean. Inner Eurasia, climate is rather different. It's harsher, drier, doesn't sustain as much agriculture, so much more of it are pastoral societies. That's Eastern Russia, Central Asia. And then the steppe products were exchanged for agricultural products and manufactured goods. And hopefully you're familiar with the Central Asian steppes from world geography. Some of those items that were traded for are hides, furs, livestock, wool, amber, and those are just a few of the items. Okay, now the creation of the second wave civilizations and the imperial states in the last 500 years BCE really included the efforts to control the pastoral peoples. And trading networks do the best when they are supported by large states or larger empires. And that's for security. When the Roman and Chinese empires were around, they anchored commerce in the 7th and 8th centuries, which would be the 600s and 700s. It became the Byzantine Empire, which was the eastern half of the Roman Empire after it split. The Abbasid dynasty, that's the Islamic Empire, and the Tang dynasty in China. And they really created a belt of strong states and supported and facilitated that long-distance trade that developed. And in the 13th and 14th centuries, at 12 and 1300s, the Mongol Empire and controlled almost the entirety of the Silk Roads. And what happened was an indirect connection between those empires, and that was through the pastoral peoples. They were kind of in the middle. This map is a great map. It does a good job of giving you an idea of where things were located. Here in purple, this is the central and inner Eurasia. And you can see a lot of the climate change does have to do with the difference in elevation, the higher altitudes. And outer Eurasia, right, this is what I was talking about. These are, even over here in the Mediterranean, considerably warmer and wetter. And you could see access to more water, obviously. And that will affect the climate. And you see in red the Silk Roads, right, that connected the East China Sea with the Mediterranean. And obviously the several stops along the way. It's always interesting to show the split here between 2 points because of the desert, as opposed to just sticking with one. I think that's interesting. But, they didn't always have to go from Merv to Antioch or Tyre in the Mediterranean. They also would go and trade with the Muslims in the Islamic Empire there and make it to the Persian Gulf, and then items were traded here as well. Okay, goods in transit. There was a vast array of goods that traveled along the Silk Roads. More often than not, it was by camel. Camels were great for those climates and the environment. It wasn't just about the drier weather, but it was also the harsher weather. Camels do very well with sand, in the sun, things like that. And most of those luxury goods were for the elite. And because of the high cost of transportation, there wasn't a lot of movement of staple goods, items that people had to have. The luxury goods are items that aren't necessarily needed for survival. And silk was what really symbolized the Eurasian exchange system, because silk was seen as the ultimate luxurious item to wear and to have. And at first, China had a monopoly on silk technology. They got from the silkworms in China, but by the 6th century, other people had learned how to produce silk from those silkworms. And silk even was used as currency in Central Asia. It was that valuable. And it became a symbol of a high status. And believe it or not, the silk industry only developed in Western Europe in the 12th century. So it took hundreds of years to really make it to Western Europe. And Western Europe would be what you'd think of now as Germany, France, even England, which is kind of like Northern Europe, but well onto the other side of the Mediterranean. And the volume of trade was small, but despite the small amounts of trade, it was of huge economic and social importance. Peasants in the Yangtze River Delta in southern China produced market goods as opposed to crops. They produced silk, paper, porcelain. You've heard of fine china, right? Porcelain. And even well-placed individuals, kind of like middlemen, could make enormous profits from this. Because if you know the only way for the guy on your left is to trade with the guy on your right, having to go through you, you could charge what you want to get those items through. And so some made huge profits. Women were very important in producing and consuming during this time period. It was really, for centuries, the Chinese silk was produced by Chinese female peasants, consumed by the elite Chinese women, and increasingly over time, elite men, especially like government officials or even religious figures in China, began to demand silk. And, Europeans would use it for clothes or wall hangings, their tapestries. But women were very important producers and consumers in the early stages of the Silk Roads. The trade network, like I said, carried lightweight yet expensive items like silk and spices. Oh, I'm sorry, I just now realized I didn't change the slide. This is what I was just talking about. And I didn't transfer the slide. Sorry. Okay. Now we're looking at cultures in transit. The cultural transmission is considered more important than the exchange of goods. And that's because of all of the effects that those trade networks had. Buddhism, for example, spread along the Silk Roads through Central and East Asia. It actually always appealed to a lot of the merchants. Conversion was heavy in the oasis cities of Central Asia. It was voluntary, and many of the Central Asian cities became centers of learning as well as commerce. And that's with the Buddhist texts and cave temples that have been found in Central Asia. But it spread more slowly amongst the Central Asian pastoralists. But in China, it was the religion of foreign merchants or rulers for centuries. And Buddhism really transformed as it spread. And we see the development of different aspects and divisions within Buddhism, which you are already familiar with. Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism is a great example of that. Okay, disease in transit. The major population centers of the Afro-Eurasian world developed characteristic disease patterns as well as ways to deal with them. Long-distance trade meant exposure to unfamiliar diseases. An early case, that's the Great Epidemic in Athens in the 400s BCE. That epidemic in Athens is what killed Pericles. You guys have heard me mention that before. During the Roman and Han empires, smallpox and measles devastated both populations. There were various outbreaks in both empires on either end. Eurasia, Rome, in Rome and Han China. In 534 to about 750 or so, a bubonic plague from India ravaged the Mediterranean world. And it really made it to Byzantium and even other places. It broke out at various times in various places around the Mediterranean. Sometimes those outbreaks would kill thousands in a day. Like a 40-day epidemic in Constantinople in 534. And we'll get more into that when we learn about that. But there's also the Black Death that spread because of the Mongols as they controlled the Silk Roads. It moved from China to Europe and the Middle East. It killed anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the European population. It's been estimated at 1/3. Some are, starting to argue that it's entirely possible that it killed nearly or closer to 1/2 of the European population. That is a phenomenal epidemic. I mean, obviously the Spanish flu in 1918 killing millions worldwide was huge too, but this is just as big, even though the numbers are smaller, because the world's population was smaller. So if you look in terms, of ratios and comparing, I mean, wow, nearly half of the European population. And there were similar death tolls in China and the Islamic world as well. It hit everywhere pretty hard. Let's see. And the Central Asian steppes that were affected really weakened Mongol power. And it could have been a bubonic plague or anthrax or even a collection of epidemic diseases. Most attribute it to what's it called? I don't remember the Latin name, but it was from the fleas that were on the rats that traveled along those trade networks. And, the Mongol Empire unifying a great portion of that, the largest land empire in history, in the 13th and 14th centuries really had a lot to do with how far and how wide that spread. And the disease exchange gave Europeans an advantage when they reached the Western Hemisphere after 1500. So being exposed to a lot of those diseases, they had generation after generation after generation to build up immunities and antibodies to those diseases. And that was a major advantage for them, because in the Western Hemisphere, the Native Americans had never been exposed to several of those epidemics. All right, and that is the end of the Silk Road. See you next time for the Sea Roads, as we look at exchange across the Indian Ocean.